And as Chris mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the effects of forest management on the relative abundance, but also on the nesting success of forest breeding birds. And I'll start with a little bit of an introduction as to what types of forest management I'm talking about, and then go into some of the research results from our studies of forest-dwelling songbirds. So the impetus for the research that I've been involved with for over a decade now is part of the Forests and Woodlands campaign of the Illinois Wildlife Action Plan. And some of the basic objectives of that campaign are to identify locations within conservation opportunity areas where forest management is occurring at scales that are compatible with monitoring the responses of wildlife to that management. These tend to be in state forests or state parks where there's ongoing forest management to affect the forest structure and composition to benefit oak hickory regeneration and kind of the maintenance of oak forests in Illinois. Because I'm an avian ecologist, I started by monitoring, studying forest-dwelling birds, and I'll kind of introduce you to those in a couple of minutes. And the goal was to develop some before and after treatment and control types of protocols to measure the responses of forest birds to the forest management practices. So getting information before management happens and then after, but also having areas of the forest that aren't being managed. So we can really kind of say that it is the management that's affecting the birds very directly. So the Forest and Woodlands campaign, so far we've established monitoring programs in a variety of locations. We started with 4 to 5, but we've actually worked in, I think, about 8 or 9 different forests within Illinois. A variety of management types. And some of these management activities include thinning, particularly thinning in the understory of things like maples and shade-tolerant tree species. There's also been a lot of prescribed fires. That seems to be one of the most commonly and frequently used tools currently to manage forests to promote oak. There's been some limited harvest in some of the locations, which is also exciting to also get some information when some harvests have occurred. Also some invasive exotic plant species control, and that can either be just a physical removal of it, but there's also been, at least in one location, aerial spraying by helicopter of invasive exotic shrubs. And so we've been trying to also look at that. And then finally, kind of a larger picture, which doesn't have to do at all with the composition and structure of the forest, but actually unfragmenting or defragmenting forests by putting more forest on the landscape. And this typically tends to be the acquisition of what is currently agricultural land and converting that agricultural land back into forests. And along with forest songbirds, we're trying to think of other groups of wildlife to monitor as well. We are somewhat limited in terms of the amount of work that we're doing with birds and the amount of money that we have to do the work, but we sometimes will put up trail cameras and try to get at the medium-sized mesocarnivores, things like raccoons, possums, bobcats, coyotes, foxes, getting their abundances or how many times you trap them with the camera traps relative to the type of management that's going on. I'm not going to talk about those species today, but I'm going to focus on the forest birds. As I mentioned, we've worked at a lot of different sites, including Oakwood Bottoms, Lake Shelbyville, the forest at Stephen Forbes State Park, Trail of Tears State Forest, up in the Chicago area, the Lake County Forest Preserves, Hidden Springs State Forest, Ramsey Lake State Park, and Siloam Springs State Park. And typically we've worked in these areas in tandem as management occurs. Some of the sites we've kind of scaled back on, some of them we've continued on since we started working in them. Just to give you one example of a specific site where we collect information from, the Trail Tier State Forest is one of DNR's demonstration project areas. And this has been a very exciting project to be a part of because while I don't have an effect on kind of the research, on the forest management, where and when that occurs, I get to piggyback with when the management is occurring to collect this additional information on the response of forest birds to that management. And so here's just a picture of kind of the beautiful habitat that is in the Trail Tiers State Forest down in southern Illinois. It's kind of Illinois Ozarks Forest. It's oak hickory ridges with beech and maple valleys or coves between those ridges. And there's a very active management plan that's being enacted there. And so here on the left shows in the blue lines are highlighting 27 different burn units within the Trail Tier State Forest. And within this larger area, on the right panel, this yellow line surrounds what is the demonstration area. And so the demonstration area includes control areas where they're not managing the forest, they're kind of letting it just do what it's doing. But there's also areas with burn units and also some thinning and even some limited harvest and prescribed fire, or thinning and prescribed fire. But then there's also all of these other management units outside of that demonstration area where burns are also occurring. And I believe they're typically trying to run 3 prescribed fires through an area within a 10-year period. So this is an example in 2014 where they had a really good year for burning, and they burned several of the burn units in that year, including some of the ones either inside of or adjacent to the demonstration area. A lot of you are probably familiar with prescribed fire. The fire is run through the forest when conditions are right, sometimes in the fall, sometimes in the spring, with the goal being to burn through the understory vegetation and to essentially get rid of a lot of the competition for the oak regeneration that we hope to see going on in these forests. As I mentioned, there's also been some thinning and limited harvest at trail tiers, and also prescribed fire on top of those things. The thinning tends to be removal of subcanopy understory trees, particularly shade-tolerant ones, to try to create a better environment for oak regeneration, increasing the amount of light that can hit the forest floor. And the limited harvest has actually been done in one area to try to open up the canopy as well, with some of the less desired species of trees, actually harvesting them and removing them from the forest, again, to open up the understory and get more light down on the regenerating oak trees. So I mentioned that I'm studying forest songbirds, and forest songbirds are kind of an amazing and diverse group of species, and they're kind of uniquely qualified, perfect basically, for studying when you are interested in trying to understand how different types of forest management might affect their populations. So forest songbirds include several species which are on the Illinois Wildlife Action Plan's species in greatest conservation need list. So we have a lot of species of forest-dwelling birds where they're facing population declines, and so therefore they're on state, sometimes regional, sometimes federal conservation lists. These group of birds need forests and woodlands, particularly for breeding, and a lot of them are migratory birds, which means that they spend their winters in kind of equatorial or southern hemisphere climates, and they migrate all the way up here during our summers to actually breed and try to produce offspring. These birds select habitat based on the vegetation structure, so they aren't necessarily specialists on a particular species of tree, but oftentimes they like to be in habitat based on the structure of the vegetation. During the summers, they tend to maintain small breeding territories that are 1 to 3 acres in size. And this makes them ideally suited for the types of management that are being done at the scale of tens to hundreds of acres at a time. So that each management unit, in theory, contains several breeding pairs for each species of bird we're interested in studying. And therefore, these birds should respond to forest management. Another wonderful thing about songbirds is they sing. The males on their territories sing from morning, oftentimes throughout the day. And their nests sometimes are relatively easy to find. So you can, in short order, get a good assessment of how the birds are doing in a particular place. Here's an example of some of the birds that exist in the understory of the forest, including ovenbirds, Kentucky warblers, worm-eating warblers, and wild turkeys. These birds all tend to spend a lot of their time in the first, like from the ground, the ground layer up to about 1 to 2 meters above ground. And specifically, these 4 species are some of the birds that actually nest on the ground or just above the ground. There's also birds of gaps and shrubby areas, including things like white-eyed vireos, northern cardinals, indigo buntings, and wood thrushes. These birds tend to focus in areas with a decent amount of shrubs or shrub cover, all the way up into the subcanopy. And then you have also birds that tend to specialize or focus in the canopy or subcanopy of the forest, including summer tanagers, red-eyed vireos, eastern wood pewees, northern parulas, and red-headed woodpeckers. So this is kind of an amazing diversity and array of birds occupying different parts of the forest from the bottom up, basically. And so if you think about how the management affects the structure of the forest, you might be able to then make some predictions about what you would expect, how you'd expect the birds to respond to that. As I mentioned, the birds are fairly easy to survey. We do what are called point counts, and we establish locations within different management units, including non-managed units. And you go to these points during the breeding season, and you stand there for a fixed amount of time, and using your ears and your eyes with binoculars, you count every bird that you see and hear. And this allows you to determine, obviously, whether they're present or absent at a point, what amount of diversity you have, how many species are you detecting at each point, but you can also detect the abundance of individual species. So say, for example, if there are indigo buntings singing, there's 2 birds singing at a point, you know that they're present and there are 2 of them. And we just can tabulate this data to give us a general idea of how the birds are responding to different types of management in the forest. So I'll kind of jump right into the kinds of results that we can get. So for example, this is data from Trail of Tears State Forest. Here we had in 2019, at the different points that we had established, we had 4 different categories of treatments. We had points that there had not been any forest management. We had a category that had prescribed fire in 2018 and 2014. Another one that had prescribed fire in 2018, 17, and 15, so 3 prescribed fires in a short amount of time. And then we also had some points in an area that had been harvested, some light harvest, and then prescribed fire the year after that. And so this is just a snapshot in 2019 of the number of species observed per survey point on average in these different categories. And these letters just mean that these three categories were not different from each other, and this one was significantly different. And so the area that had a light harvest followed by prescribed fire in 2019 actually had a higher number of species observed per point. It's not a lot more, but it is statistically significantly more. And we suspect that the reason for this is that the harvest plus the fire modifies the structure of the habitat in a way that tends to promote a better diversity of species. But then if you drill down and you look at just the individual species responses, they're highly variable and it all depends on which species you're talking about. We tend to generally lump species into one of three categories. So here's an example of some of the individual species that had positive responses to one or more of the management categories. So these are the same four categories as in the previous graph. Here, the main thing to focus on is the green bars represent where there's been no management. And so what we're looking for in terms of positive responses are where you have birds that are more abundant in one or more of these management categories compared to where there's been no management. So things like Acadian flycatchers, eastern wood pewees, red-bellied woodpeckers, summer tanagers, mourning doves, Kentucky warblers, white-eyed vireos. So species from the ground to woodpeckers, which tend to focus on snags and dead and dying wood, to some canopy dwelling species, all had positive responses to one or more of the management categories relative to the non-managed areas. And if I shine a spotlight on a couple of those, one would be the Kentucky warbler. So this is a species that actually nests near the ground, but because there had been at least one growing season between the most recent prescribed fire, there was actually a fairly decent flush of vegetation in that kind of first 1 meter from the ground up. And so Kentucky warblers actually increased in the area where there'd been a harvest followed by prescribed fire. Red-bellied woodpeckers tended to be more abundant in all the management categories compared to the non-management. And this is probably because the fire and the harvest, they all create disturbance, which can increase the amount of dead and dying standing wood in the forest. It actually can promote snags within the forest as well. And woodpeckers, they depend on this kind of dead and dying wood in the forest. And so the red-bellied woodpecker, among some other woodpeckers, tend to be more abundant when you have management going on. There's also a slate of species that in the year following these different types of management, they can have negative responses. So here what you would see is where there's been no treatment, that those green bars in this graph tend to be higher than all or most of the management categories. So some of those species include worm-eating warbler, yellow-billed cuckoo, hooded warbler, scarlet tanager, ovenbird, American crows, and Carolina chickadees. Again, a really diverse group of birds having a negative response. Spotlighting two of them, the hooded warbler is a shrub nesting species. And it tended to do poorly when you had 2 to 3 prescribed fires within a 5-year period. And that's probably because the shrub layer tends to get burned in the course of having fairly frequent prescribed fire. And if that's where you build your nests, you're likely going to move out of those units and maybe nest in a nearby adjacent unit. So the hooded warblers become less abundant in places where there's frequent prescribed fire. The ovenbirds, they did poorly or decreased in number in places regardless of the type of management going on. And this is probably because of the prescribed fire again. These birds actually nest on the ground in the leaf litter. And so the prescribed fire running through the forest, either recently or fairly frequently, can make it so that, again, you have an unfavorable place for ovenbirds to nest, and they will likely move to a different part of the forest that hasn't been burned recently. And finally, you get species that actually show a mixed response, where in one of the management categories, they tend to do really well, and in others, they don't. And you have the kind of abundance in the non-managed units somewhere in the middle. So red-eyed vireos are a species of the canopy, and for some reason, they did well with like an intermediate amount of prescribed fire, and also where there's no treatment been done. And then brown-headed cowbirds are a brood parasite, meaning that they lay their eggs in the nests of other bird species. And it seemed like they actually increased in abundance when you had frequent prescribed fire. And we speculate that this might be that amount of prescribed fire, by opening up the forest floor and creating exposed soil forest for short periods of time, that the cowbirds can actually benefit from that by foraging on that exposed soil, rather than leaving the forest and going to local or nearby agricultural lands, which is usually what they would do when they're foraging. So positive, negative, and mixed responses. Another thing to note about these responses, though, is that this is a one-year snapshot, and it's very likely that a unit that's been burned frequently, but then is left alone for a number of years, it changes. And a lot of the species that may have left or avoided that frequently burned unit may very well show up back in there a year or two later, because of, again, the flush of vegetation that tends to follow when you have prescribed fire. So looking at three different forest complexes separate from Trail of Tears: Oakwood Bottoms, Lake Shelbyville Forest, and then the Lake County Forest Preserve. Typically what we see when we categorize species as either positive, mixed, or negative responses to forest management is that the vast majority of them have either positive or mixed responses, and not very many have negative responses to forest management. And this is really important because the forests are being managed for the forest structure and tree species composition, not necessarily to promote forest-dwelling songbirds. And so it's very exciting to be able to document that, by and large, the management that's being done for the forest is having either positive or a mixed effect on forest-dwelling songbirds, and very infrequently is it a negative effect. One other thing that we have to acknowledge is that these forest-dwelling birds not only respond to the structure of the forest, but they also respond to the landscape surrounding the forest that they're in. And so some species will avoid edges. So when you have agriculture running right up to the edge of the forest, those hard edges that are created, some species don't like those. Other species actually like the edge. So when we think about the management that's being done, it doesn't happen in isolation. It happens within a landscape that, some parts of the forest are near non-forest habitat. Some of these forests that are being managed have a lot of non-forest habitat in the general area surrounding them. And so when we consider that on top of the management, we tend to see some really interesting patterns. So for example, Cadian flycatchers, when we think about the effects of prescribed fire, plus how far you are from the nearest forest edge. So if you're far from the edge, you're in the interior. If you're near the edge, you're basically on the edge of the forest. In three different types of management categories based on burn frequency. So frequent fires are 3 or more fires in a 5-year period. Infrequent fire is 1 to 2 fires within a 5-year period. And then we have those areas that are non-burned. Acadian flycatchers really don't like existing near the edge, regardless of what management is. But then as you move farther away from the edge, here we're talking about out to a kilometer to 1.5 kilometers away in the interior of the forest, Acadian flycatchers become much more abundant. And what we can also see is that they actually become more abundant when there's been frequent fire. Indigo buntings are a species that is an edge and disturbance loving species. So they're actually most abundant regardless of the management near the edge, and they decrease in abundance as you move away from the edge. And it turns out that they also respond favorably to frequent and infrequent fire. So the disturbance created by frequent and infrequent fire in the interior of the forest can create some disturbed habitat that the indigo buntings seem to be attracted to relative to if you don't do anything to the forest. So this is an example of how the management plus where you are within the forest, also they both influence the abundances of these different types of songbirds. We can also look at prescribed fire plus how forested the landscape is within a 2-kilometer radius around each of the census points. So this is kind of like a fragmentation index, if you will. And so when we include both the management plus the landscape context, we see that both are very important when it comes to a lot of different forest dwelling birds. So great crested flycatchers and blue jays tend to prefer areas that are a bit more fragmented, where you have less forest cover on the landscape, and then they tend to become less abundant where you have more forest cover on the landscape. But there's also an effect of the prescribed fires. So here, great crested flycatchers are most abundant where you have frequent fires or infrequent fires compared to no fires at all. The blue jays are kind of they don't really respond much to the management, but they respond more to the landscape context. Then you have species like yellow-billed cuckoos, red-eyed vireos, and scarlet tanagers, and all three of those species do much better in less fragmented forests. So their abundances increase as the proportion of forest cover there is within 2 kilometers increases. And they also have kind of mixed responses to different types of prescribed fire. Nearly all of these species are insectivores, and we oftentimes think that the reason that they might respond favorably to prescribed fire is that the flush of vegetation in the growing season following prescribed fire tends to promote a lot of insect life, which is feeding on that new growth of vegetation in the forest understory. And a lot of those insects become flighted or work their way up into the shrub layer and subcanopy of the forest. And so when your job for the summer is to produce baby birds and you feed those baby birds almost exclusively insects, the prescribed fire in a previous season or a number of prescribed fires in previous seasons can actually promote insect abundance, which then promotes the bird abundance. So it's this kind of really cool food web dynamic that we might see going on in association with prescribed fire. So I talked about forest fragmentation, and part of the work that we've done that's kind of separate from managing forests with prescribed fire and thinning and harvest is the concept of reforesting the landscape. So trying to reduce the amount of fragmentation that exists. One kind of case study that we did was over in the Hutchins Creek Valley, which is over in the western Shawnee Hills. This is an example of, this is where the county where it's located in Union County. And Hutchins Creek is this non-forested ravine right here in what would otherwise be a large contiguous block of forest in the Shawnee National Forest. Over the course of 3 years, we looked for Acadian flycatcher nests next to this Hutchins Creek inholding, and then far away from the inholding into the interior of the forest. So the Acadian flycatcher was our lab rat in terms of finding nests and then documenting whether those nests received any cowbird eggs, and then whether those nests ultimately succeeded or failed. Typically, nests fail because different types of predators find them and eat the eggs and or the nestlings that are in the nests. So in 3 years, we found about 300 Acadian flycatcher nests. And what we were interested in understanding was how successful are the nests near this agricultural inholding versus far away from it in the interior of the forest. We found a really stark pattern where here the dashed line represents nest predation. So the higher the amount of nest predation, the higher the amount of failure of nests. The non-dashed line represents what proportion of the nests were parasitized. So what you can see is near that edge, close to that agricultural inholding, both nest predation and cowbird parasitism were high, meaning that very few nests were successful. And even if those nests were successful, they oftentimes only had cowbirds coming out of them. However, as you moved into the interior of the forest, the cowbird parasitism dropped fairly quickly, and the nest predation slowly but surely dropped. So that if you got to be 2 kilometers away from the forest, you had really low levels of both and really good nesting success. Somewhere at about 600 meters, we had low enough levels of predation and low enough levels of cowbird parasitism that anywhere further into the forest from this point, you actually had more offspring being produced than what's needed to maintain the population. So there you would see population growth. Whereas if you were less than 600 meters from the forest edge, you didn't have enough offspring being produced to maintain those populations. So if we draw kind of a schematic based on that result, around the Hutchins Creek Valley here, which has no forest in it and had agriculture at the time, within that 600 meters of that, we had what we call sink habitat. There's not enough offspring being produced to maintain the population. But when you get beyond that threshold, we had lots and lots of area in the interior of the forest that actually was being source habitat. It was producing enough offspring to maintain those populations. And this was very exciting because with that information, a number of different groups, both government groups and also non-government groups, worked together to try to acquire the 4 or 5 different properties that made up the Hutchins Creek Valley. And they were very successful actually in acquiring and removing the agriculture from nearly all of it. And so what we then were able to see is that with the acquisition of that just 205 hectares of habitat that was not in forest, it actually added about 1,300 hectares of source habitat for Acadian flycatchers and other forest-dwelling birds. So in terms of bang for the buck, this reforestation effort, for every acre of non-forest that was acquired, over 6 acres of source habitat was created. So this was a great success story. In the Cache River watershed in southern Illinois, we have used prothonotary warblers to look at kind of local scale habitat effects on cowbird parasitism. Again, with the idea of how can we prioritize land acquisition and reforestation efforts to benefit forest-dwelling songbirds. So here we would take an area of swamp where these birds were nesting, and we would document their parasitism rates in that swamp And then we would compare those parasitism rates to the amount of forest cover there was within 3 kilometers, or the amount of agriculture, if you will, within 3 kilometers. And what we found, here each dot represents a different site where we had all of this information. And when you go from areas where there's very little forest cover within 3 kilometers to areas that have almost 80% forest cover within that 3 kilometer radius, parasitism rates are exceedingly high when you don't have a lot of forest cover. So that means there's a lot of cowbirds in those type of areas. The cowbirds thrive in areas where you have hosts in the forest where they lay their eggs, and then they have access to agricultural land, whether it's row crop or pasture, nearby, which is where they go to forage. And so this was another result showing that where you have little forest cover, you have high rates of cowbird parasitism, which means not much nesting success. And only when you get into areas that have 80% or more forest cover do you have low enough parasitism to promote population growth. We did a lot of nest searching and monitoring in the Cache River watershed in a similar way that we had done with the Acadian flycatchers, where we have to find bird nests, monitor them every 3 to 5 days, document cowbird parasitism, and then whether they fledged or failed. In the Cache River watershed, where there was an active land acquisition and reforestation effort going on, at the beginning of that effort, we spent 3 years searching for and monitoring nests, and we found well over 600 nests. We followed up several years later after a lot of land had been acquired and we had kind of new early successional forests on the landscape that hadn't been there before. We visited the same places and we found over 800 nests. And it included enough nests from 7 species that we could make comparisons to look at how things had improved between the early period where there was a lot of agriculture mixed in with the forests where we were, compared to the later period where we had a lot of, no longer had as much agriculture in close proximity to where we were studying the nesting success of these birds. And similar to what we found with the prothonotarids previously, nest survival tended to be relatively high when you had not a lot of agriculture within 1 kilometer of where you were, where the nests were located. And then for all 7 species, the pattern was that you had decreasing nest survival as you got out to places where you had a lot of agriculture within close proximity to the nest. The same thing applied to cowbird parasitism. Rates of cowbird parasitism tended to be low where you had smaller amounts of agriculture within a 5 kilometer radius, and those tended to increase, those rates of parasitism, with the more agricultural land that you had in the landscape within a 5 kilometer radius. So these 2 results in tandem for all these different species, again, showed how important it was to acquire non-forested land and to defragment those forests. And the effect of that was a reduction in the amount of cowbird parasitism and also an increase in nesting success because you also reduced nest predation. So you reduce cowbird parasitism and you reduce nest failure where predators come and eat the nest. And the predators that are usually responsible for it include things like rat snakes, blue jays and crows, raccoons, and a wide variety of other types of predators. These nest predators tend to thrive in landscapes that are a blend of forest and agriculture, the same way that cowbirds tend to thrive in those landscapes. So when you can actually push the landscape to be more forested, you actually can have a very direct effect in reducing the negative effects of predators and of cowbirds. And so here's a really cool example of how this played out over time. So in the Cache River watershed, we had watershed-wide conditions during that early period for Acadian flycatchers. So there's much fragmentation in the landscape. For Acadian flycatchers, with a sample of over 350 nests, 40% of those nests had received at least one cowbird egg. Roll forward to the later period where we went back and went to the same places and looked for nests again. We had over 600 Acadian flycatcher nests, and parasitism was only half of what it had been in the very same places where now you have more forest cover and less agriculture. So it was very direct effect of the reforestation efforts. So here's an example specifically where we had Acadian flycatcher nests in this parcel of forest here and this parcel of forest here. Parasitism rates were 30% here and 46% here in that early period. And then if you roll forward, the dark green areas indicate areas that were agriculture in the early period, but were now young forest because of land acquisition and reforestation efforts. And what happened to those parasitism rates? The area that had nearly 30% parasitism dropped down to very low parasitism at only 10% of the nests. Whereas this parcel of forest, which still had all of this agriculture next to it, didn't really change any. So this was a really great example of, with Acadian flycatchers, how by surrounding a parcel of forest that once existed in a fragmented landscape, surrounding it with new forest, you can have a greatly reduced cowbird parasitism rate because of that effort by the land managers. So combining the forest management with these land acquisition and reforestation efforts, any place where you can improve nesting success of birds, well, how do we know that that will actually increase the abundance of birds? We also, by studying prothonotary warblers, were able to look at the return rates of individual birds from one year to the next based on how productive they were during the breeding season. So we would catch hundreds of pairs of prothonotary warblers nesting in the Cache River watershed, and we would put color bands on their legs so that we knew every single individual in our study population. And over the course of the summer, we could document whether they produced nothing, because in this case, raccoons tended to prey on all of their nesting attempts. Some of the birds would produce one batch of offspring, and some that were in really good habitat could actually get two batches of offspring produced in one breeding season. So we actually wanted to look at what proportion of those individual males and females in those three categories came back the next year and tried to breed in the same area again. And what we found was, where birds were unsuccessful, they came back to those same sites at a much lower rate than those that produced one batch of offspring. And those that produced two batches of offspring, nearly 80% of those individuals were actually back on the same sites and in the same territories the following year. And so these birds are actually making what we call decision rules. And they will, if they're in a place where they're highly successful, they will come back at an extremely high rate to those same sites. However, where they fail, they will actually avoid returning back to those places. And I like to joke that in this instance, birds have better decision-making ability than some people that I know. And I say that because when they experience something really good, they actually return to that good thing. And if they experience something that's bad, they actually avoid returning to it. And I have a lot of friends and family members, and probably even myself, where I've had a bad experience and somehow returned back to that same bad thing. And it maybe took me a long time to learn, or took my friends a long time to learn. So what this means, though, is that when you see birds in high abundances, it reflects that that is good quality habitat for breeding success. And that's very exciting. So in the end, by tagging on to this awesome forest management that's going on, whether it's prescribed fire thinning, harvesting, or land acquisition and reforestation efforts, by studying birds, these birds have a lot that they can tell us. They can tell us what's threatening our populations. Typically, habitat fragmentation is the biggest threat because it increases populations of nest predators and cowbirds, which causes a lot of nest failure. We can, by studying them, the birds can tell us how well they respond to the different types of management that I've talked about, and also restoration in the form of reforestation. And it can also tell us about the importance of partnerships. This can be land managers, private landowners, and researchers, all doing good things to the landscape and collecting data to look at what the effects of those good things are, both on the forest and, in this case, on forest songbirds. And in this way, we can measure the success of different types of conservation actions being implemented by forest land managers, private citizens, and the like. And so birds have much to tell us. We just need to continue listening to them. I thank you for your attention, and I'll put up one more slide while I'm answering questions, just to acknowledge that all of this work, including the forest management, the land acquisition and reforestation efforts, and the support to actually conduct the bird research that we do, requires a lot of different partners. And this is just a list of some of those folks.